In the Middle Ages, crops had to grow or people starved. There were no second chances. That pressure led to some of the smartest gardening tricks ever used. Most have been forgotten, but they still work. These 20 medieval hacks might be the most useful things you've never heard of. And it all starts with a clever planting trick. Medieval farmers discovered something magical about corn, beans, and squash growing together. They called it the Three Sisters method, and it worked better than any family dinner table arrangement. The corn stood tall, giving the beans something sturdy to climb. The beans wrapped around the corn stalks and pulled nitrogen from the air, feeding it directly to the soil. Meanwhile, the squash spread its huge leaves across the ground, blocking weeds and keeping moisture locked in the earth. It was like having roommates who actually got along and helped with the chores. The three plants never fought each other for resources because they each needed different things. The timing was crucial. Corn needed to grow about 6 inches tall before adding the beans and squash. The corn basically had to hit the gym before its friends could move in and start climbing all over it. The system worked so well that some gardens produced enough food to feed entire families from just a few planted squares. Of course, having perfectly arranged plants meant nothing if they died of thirst. Water was more valuable than gold in medieval times, so clever gardeners invented a watering system that never wasted a single drop. They buried unglazed clay pots right next to their plants, leaving only the rim sticking above ground. These buried vessels slowly leaked water through their porous walls, creating underground moisture that plant roots could find and drink. These leaky containers were the only time in history when having holes in your bucket was exactly what you wanted. The moisture moved through the soil at just the right speed to keep roots happy without drowning them. Medieval potters made special irrigation vessels in different sizes for various crops. The pots were like underground room service, delivering water directly to plant roots without any fuss or mess on the surface. The buried pot system required almost no daily maintenance once it was set up properly. While plants sipped water underground, medieval gardeners needed protection from unwelcome visitors above ground. Medieval gardeners turned certain herbs into nature's security guards, using their powerful scents to keep harmful insects away from precious crops. Tansy stood guard against flies and ants with its bitter smell. Rue scared off beetles so effectively that they would turn around and march away. Wormwood was the ultimate pest bouncer, making fleas and moths pack up and leave the neighborhood entirely. The herbs basically told bugs to buzz off without having to say a single word. These protective herbs contain natural oils that insects absolutely despised. Gardeners planted them around garden borders like a living fence or scattered them throughout crop rows as bodyguards. These herbs were like having a bouncer at the garden gate who never took breaks and worked for free. Medieval people stuffed their mattresses with dried wormwood to keep fleas away. Growing these protective herbs required minimal effort since most thrived in poor soil conditions, but not all garden helpers came from the plant kingdom. Medieval gardens buzzed with activity from more than just insects and plants. Smart gardeners recruited animal workers who earned their keep by handling important garden jobs. Geese waddled through garden paths, carefully eating weeds while leaving crops completely alone. Chickens scratched through soil hunting for harmful insects and grubs. Ducks patrolled wet areas, gobbling up slugs and snails with great enthusiasm. These feathered employees worked for room and board, which was probably the world's first live-in employment package. The animals provided pest control services during the day and produced valuable fertilizer around the clock. Geese were especially valuable because they seemed to understand which plants were weeds and which were crops. The chickens basically did the gardener's dirty work while thinking they were just having fun scratching around for snacks. The manure produced by these animal helpers was like black gold for medieval gardens. Beyond managing animals, medieval gardeners also looked to the heavens for guidance. Medieval gardeners looked to the night sky for planting guidance, following lunar phases as carefully as they followed recipes for bread. When the moon appeared to grow larger each night, they planted leafy vegetables like lettuce and cabbage. When the moon seemed to shrink, they focused on root crops like carrots and onions. If the moon could push around entire seas, medieval gardeners figured it could probably give their vegetables a helpful nudge too. During waxing moon phases, plant energy supposedly moved upward into leaves and stems. During waning phases, plant energy flowed downward into roots and underground parts. The moon basically became the world's first gardening consultant, giving advice from millions of miles away without charging a consultation fee. Medieval farming families developed detailed lunar calendars showing the best moon days for different garden activities throughout the year. Whether moon planting worked because of actual lunar influence or simply because it helped gardeners stay organized, the method kept medieval gardens productive year after year. While watching the sky provided planting schedules, medieval gardeners also needed to understand what lay beneath their feet. Medieval gardeners became soil detectives who solved earth mysteries using only their senses and careful observation. They watched for earthworms, which were like tiny soil quality inspectors. Finding lots of worms meant the earth was rich and healthy. Wild plants like chickweed and nettles growing thick and green were nature's way of posting signs that read, "Excellent soil here." Healthy dirt was basically nature's perfume, while bad soil smelled like it needed a bath. Good soil had a pleasant, earthy smell that reminded people of fresh forest floors, while problem soil smells sour or rotten. Gardeners would grab handfuls of earth and squeeze it, checking for the perfect crumbly texture. Medieval gardeners could read soil like a book, except this book told them whether their dinner would grow or not. Soil color told important stories too. Dark, rich earth indicated plenty of nutrients, while pale soil usually needed help. Good soil knowledge was essential, but medieval gardeners faced an even bigger challenge when temperatures dropped. Winter did not signal the end of gardening for medieval farmers who knew how to outsmart freezing temperatures. They constructed cold frames using pieces of glass or thin sheets of animal horn to create miniature greenhouses over their planting beds. These simple structures captured warm air during sunny days and shielded plants from icy winds at night. They basically tucked their plants into bed with the warmest blankets available, except the plants never complained about being too hot. Medieval gardeners covered their growing areas with thick layers of straw or wool blankets when temperatures plummeted. Hardy crops like kale and leeks could handle cold weather so well they continued growing even when snow blanketed the ground. These winter vegetables were tougher than knights in armor, growing happily while everything else was hibernating. The most dedicated gardeners managed to harvest fresh vegetables well into December. Cold protection helped plants survive winter, but the smartest gardeners went one step further. Medieval gardeners discovered that fresh animal manure created natural heating systems buried beneath their plants. They dug trenches or pits, filled them with fresh droppings, then covered everything with planting soil. As the manure decomposed, it generated warmth that kept plant roots comfortable even when surface air was freezing cold. The decomposing manure worked like a reliable furnace that never needed coal deliveries or chimney cleaning. This underground heating method allowed gardeners to start spring vegetables weeks before the normal planting season arrived. Different types of manure produced varying amounts of heat. Horse manure was considered premium fuel because it heated quickly and maintained steady warmth. Animal waste became more valuable than some people's furniture, at least when it came to keeping gardens warm. Timing the setup required careful planning to let the initial hot phase cool down to comfortable levels for plant roots. Heat from decomposing manure was valuable, but medieval gardeners had another way to transform waste into garden treasure. Medieval gardeners transformed kitchen scraps and garden waste into valuable soil improvement through systematic compost management. They layered green materials like vegetable peelings with brown materials such as straw and dried leaves. Wood ash or lime sprinkled between layers controlled strong odors and prevented complaints from neighbors. Medieval households wasted less food than a restaurant dishwasher because everything eventually fed the soil. Everything organic had potential value in the composting system. Vegetable trimmings, eggshells, animal bedding, garden weeds, and even human hair found their way into these decomposition centers. The compost pile was like a slow-cooking recipe that took months instead of hours, and the final dish was pure garden gold. Storage methods varied from excavated pits to wooden bins or large woven baskets. Turning compost piles was essential work that accelerated the breakdown process. Creating rich compost was important, but medieval farmers knew that what you planted was just as crucial. Medieval farmers learned that planting the same crops in identical locations year after year depleted soil nutrients and invited pest problems. They developed rotation systems that moved different plant types through their fields in carefully planned sequences. The most common cycle included legumes, followed by root vegetables, then grains, and finally a fallow rest period. Legumes were like helpful dinner guests who brought more food than they ate, pulling nitrogen from thin air and leaving it in the soil for future crops. Root vegetables broke up compacted soil layers with their deep growth, while grains efficiently used remaining nutrients before the land entered its recovery phase. Crop rotation was basically musical chairs for vegetables, except everyone got a better seat when the music stopped. The fallow year was when soil rebuilt its fertility naturally. Medieval farmers maintained detailed records about which crops grew each year to ensure proper sequences, but maximizing space was only part of the medieval gardening story. Medieval families often maintained secret garden plots tucked away behind barns or in forgotten corners of their property. These hidden growing spaces served as backup food sources during difficult years when main gardens failed. These gardens were like having a secret stash of emergency snacks, except the snacks were turnips and the emergency could last all winter. Women often managed these private gardens separately, growing medicinal plants and cooking herbs. The secrecy kept valuable resources safe from thieves, wandering animals, or tax collectors. Medieval families basically invented the concept of premium real estate, except the property values were measured in parsnips per square foot. Behind barns provided protection from wind and curious eyes while still receiving adequate sunlight. The soil was often the richest on the property because families quietly carried kitchen scraps there for years. Religious communities took garden planning to entirely different levels. Monasteries became the agricultural universities of medieval times, where monks developed and perfected advanced gardening techniques. These religious communities had educated members, stable populations, and enough resources to experiment with new growing methods. Monastery gardens were planned with mathematical precision, as if God himself had handed down blueprints for the perfect vegetable layout. Monks organized their growing areas into neat raised beds arranged in geometric patterns. They created detailed maps showing exactly where each type of plant should grow and when it should be planted. These monks were basically running medieval research laboratories, except their test tubes were flower pots, and their hypothesis involved whether beans would grow better with prayers. The monks grew food for daily meals, medicine for their infirmary, and rare plants that other gardeners had never seen. They maintained extensive libraries containing gardening knowledge from across the known world. Record keeping was crucial. Monks documented planting dates, weather patterns, and harvest amounts. Beyond monastery walls, many gardens welcomed plants that others might consider unwanted. Medieval gardens looked different from modern ones because gardeners deliberately allowed many wild plants to grow alongside their cultivated crops. What we might call weeds today were often valuable food sources, medicines, or useful materials. Purslane was nature's way of providing free salad ingredients to anyone too lazy to plant lettuce. This succulent weed was packed with nutrients and could be eaten raw or cooked like spinach. The plant thrived in poor soil and dry conditions, making it an excellent backup food source. Kids became walking encyclopedias of edible plants, except their knowledge came with the risk of accidentally eating something that would give them a stomachache. Nettles were another valuable wild plant. Young nettle leaves could be cooked and eaten like greens, while mature plants were used to make fabric, rope, and medicine. Children played an important role in gathering wild plants. Medieval families also used wild plants for practical purposes. Certain weeds made excellent natural dyes for coloring cloth. This acceptance of wild plants was part of making use of everything available, especially for ensuring future harvests. Saving seeds was crucial for medieval gardeners, as purchasing new seeds each year was expensive and often impossible. Families developed sophisticated methods for selecting, harvesting, drying, and storing seeds for the following season. Medieval seed selection was like choosing the star athletes for next year's team, except the sport was growing big, and the prize was not starving. The selection process began while plants were still growing. Medieval gardeners marked their best-performing plants with small stones or strips of cloth. Only seeds from the healthiest, most productive plants were saved. Timing the harvest was critical. Seeds needed to be fully mature, but not yet scattered by wind or eaten by birds. Proper seed storage was more important than protecting the family jewels, mainly because you could eat seeds if times got really tough. Clay jars with tight-fitting lids were popular storage containers, often sealed with wax. Medieval families used colored cloth bags or carved symbols to identify different seed types. Keeping seeds safe was just one part of protecting valuable garden equipment. Medieval gardeners treated their tools like precious possessions because replacing them was expensive and time-consuming. Most families owned only a few basic implements that needed to last for years or even decades. These storage buildings were basically medieval safety deposit boxes, except instead of keeping money safe, they protected the equipment that helped make money grow in the ground. Tool sheds or small storage huts protected valuable implements from weather and theft. The structures were usually built near the main garden area for easy access. Tool maintenance was like giving your equipment annual checkups, except the doctor was the person who owned the tools, and the payment was having equipment that actually worked when you needed it. Inside these storage areas, wooden shelves held dried seeds, bundles of useful herbs, and small repair items like wooden handles and metal files. Maintenance was a winter activity when outdoor garden work slowed down. Gardeners would sharpen metal blades and oil wooden handles to prevent cracking. The herb drying function connected to broader community practices where multiple families worked together. Many medieval villages organized large communal gardens where multiple families shared the work, resources, and harvest. This cooperative approach allowed small communities to tackle bigger growing projects than any single family could manage alone. Village gardening was like organizing a barn raising, except instead of building something, everyone was growing something. And instead of one big party at the end, there were vegetables for everyone all winter long. Families contributed different skills and resources. Some provided tools, others brought seeds, and everyone pitched in with labor. Sharing communal harvests required more diplomatic skills than negotiating peace treaties, especially when determining who got the biggest cabbages. The division of work was carefully organized to make the best use of each family's strengths. Older residents might handle seed preparation, while younger people took on heavy digging. Harvest distribution required fair systems that prevented arguments. Storage of communal harvests took place in shared facilities like village cellars or barns. This cooperative spirit extended to careful planning and timing that successful gardens required. Medieval gardeners created detailed calendars that tracked the best times for every garden activity throughout the year. These calendars were often handmade and highly personalized, incorporating local climate patterns, religious festivals, and family traditions. These calendars were more reliable than the village gossip for predicting what would happen next, and considerably more useful for planning dinner. The calendars served as comprehensive guides for garden planning, showing when to plant each crop, when to expect harvests, and when to perform maintenance tasks. Many families carved their calendars into wooden boards. Medieval garden calendars were like having a crystal ball that actually worked, at least for predicting when to plant turnips and when to expect the first frost. Religious festivals were often incorporated because they provided reliable dates that everyone remembered. Moon phases were frequently included, with different lunar periods marked for specific planting activities. The calendars also noted seasonal weather patterns and wildlife activity, such as when migrating birds returned or when certain insects typically appeared. These detailed planning systems often included specific guidance for particular crops that could help protect entire gardens. Medieval gardeners discovered that garlic was one of the most versatile plants in their arsenal, serving as food, medicine, and natural pest control all in one package. They planted garlic strategically throughout their gardens to protect more vulnerable crops from insects, diseases, and soil problems. Garlic was like having a security guard for your vegetables, except this guard worked for free and you could eat him at the end of his shift. The strong sulfur compounds that gave garlic its distinctive smell also made it an effective deterrent against many common garden pests, including aphids, rootworms, and various soil-dwelling insects. Garlic tea became a popular natural insecticide that gardeners sprayed on their crops. They would crush fresh garlic cloves, steep them in water for several days, then strain the liquid and apply it to plant leaves. Garlic created an invisible fence around gardens that was more effective than any physical barrier, mainly because bugs found the smell as overwhelming as humans did when someone ate too much of it. The antifungal properties also helped protect nearby plants from mold and fungus problems. Planting garlic around garden edges created a natural barrier that many pests refused to cross. Medieval gardeners also developed clever strategies that used other plants as protection systems. Medieval gardeners developed clever strategies for protecting their main crops by deliberately planting decoy plants that attracted pests away from their valuable vegetables. These trap crops were essentially sacrificial plants that drew harmful insects to designated areas where they could be easily destroyed. Mustard plants were like opening a restaurant that only served food bugs loved, except the restaurant was located far away from where humans kept their actual dinner. Mustard was one of the most popular trap crops because it attracted many common garden pests, including flea beetles, aphids, and cabbage worms. Gardeners would plant rows of mustard at garden edges, then regularly check for pest infestations. Managing trap crops required the strategic thinking of a military general, except the enemy was aphids and the battlefield was a vegetable patch. Radishes served a similar function, particularly for root maggots and other soil-dwelling pests. The fast-growing radishes would sprout quickly and attract pests before main crops were vulnerable. The success depended on careful timing and placement. Trap crops needed to be planted early enough to attract pests before they found the main crops. Some gardeners used multiple types to target different pest species. This strategic approach was part of a broader philosophy about plants that could keep producing food year after year. Medieval gardeners understood the value of plants that kept producing food year after year without needing to be replanted annually. Perennial crops like rhubarb, asparagus, and berry bushes represented long-term investments that would feed families for decades. Perennial plants were like making a deal with nature where you did all the hard work up front and then collected payments in the form of food for the next 20 years. These crops required more initial planning than annual vegetables, but they provided reliable harvests with minimal ongoing work once mature and established. Berry bushes were like having guard dogs that paid their keep in jam and pie fillings instead of just barking at strangers. Asparagus was particularly prized because it produced fresh food in early spring when stored winter vegetables were running low. Berry bushes provided both food and natural boundaries for garden areas. The placement required careful consideration because these plants would occupy their locations for many years. Gardeners typically planted them along borders, fence lines, or in permanent beds. Medieval gardeners also learned to propagate their perennial plants by dividing established clumps. And there you have it. These 20 techniques show how medieval gardeners mastered the art of growing food with simple tools, clever thinking, and deep understanding of nature's patterns.